Generations are a complicated topic, but one that can give us immense insight into who we are and who we'll turn out to be. When I was looking into Gen Z for the first time, a lot of different experts came up. Some of them were people like David Stillman or Jonathan Haidt, and those are people that I might go into later on. However, one person above all came up, and that was Jean Twenge, a psychologist at San Diego University. So today we're going to talk about a lot of her ideas and break down her thoughts on what it means to be Gen Z, what we're dealing with, and who we are. So let's look into it. So the first question is, who is Jean Twenge? Well, like I was saying before, Jean Twenge is a psychologist who works at San Diego University. And one of her main focuses, if not the focus, are the differences between generations. So this all began for her in back in the 90s or early 2000s, I believe. I think it was the 90s. And she talks about how she was looking at the differences between her generation, Gen X, and boomers. And she says that there's a lot of stereotypes at the time that were based on very little data. And that was something that bothered her. But I'll let her use her own words.
Yeah, so I, I am a Gen Xer. In the early 90s, I was working on my college honors thesis, and I noticed that the my fellow undergrads were scoring very differently on a psychology questionnaire than the 1970s test manual said that they should. So this questionnaire had things about assertiveness and leadership, and the women in particular just look completely different. Made me realize, well, that actually makes sense because roles for women have changed a lot over that 20-year period. So that was my first study on generational differences.
So at first she began to look into Gen X, like she was talking about. Then she went on to write a book called Generation Me, which was about millennials and hit on the higher self-esteem and the self-esteem movement that affected millennials. Then come about 2012, and in retrospect, I think she was looking at this maybe in 2014 or 2015, but she saw a marked change. And this is where she really sees the difference between Generation Z and millennials, because that's when we see a huge uptick in things like internalizing disorders. Now, that's something I've talked about in other videos. That is things like anxiety, depression, feeling bad about yourself, feeling like you don't have a lot of ability to affect the world, you don't have confidence in who you are, you don't feel like you're competent, like you can get things done, study for your tests, do a good job. You don't feel like you can do that. And that's the rise of internalizing disorders. She saw that around 2012, and that's when she gets into thinking about and studying why this might be the case. Now, the first most obvious explanation that a lot of people turn to is that kids these days are just more likely to talk about it. They just feel more comfortable talking about many of the anxious symptoms that people have had for all time. Now, there are several issues with this. One in particular is that it's just as possible to be the opposite, meaning that people can deal with problems and then need to talk about it because those problems are larger. So rather than people being more comfortable, for instance, to talk about alcoholism, well, if alcoholism were everywhere, if everyone was an alcoholic, well, then we would be forced to talk about it. The comfort would come because of the necessity, because of the need to talk about it. So that's one thing. But another thing is that rather than this being some isolated event, this is something you can see and track with real data. What does that mean? Well, when I say real data, you can look at suicide attempts, for instance, or self-harm, or people going to the hospital. And these things indeed have gone up right along with it. Just as these feelings have been expressed by Gen Z, these exact symptoms have been seen coming in real life. Not on a screen, not necessarily just because of a survey, but in real life we can see these things. The next possibility she talks about is that maybe it could be the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe that's the reason that so many young people are struggling with these feelings of loneliness, depression, anxiety, etc. Well, there's a huge problem with that, and that is it misses this uptick by about 8 years. About 8 years. Now, while this could have contributed or it could have exacerbated the symptoms, it could have made it much worse, that does not seem to be the actual cause. So when you look at it, and we showed this in the graph before, you can see that the uptick begins around the 2012, 2010 range, depending upon the survey and what you're looking at. And so the idea of it being COVID-19 doesn't seem to line up. Another possibility is that maybe it was the economy all along. A lot of economically minded people might go strictly to that the job market around 2008 and going into 2012, maybe that just wasn't good enough. But the problem is that when this got the worst, when this was at its apex and going up, what were the time frames? Well, it was actually when the economy was strongest. It was when we were on an economic recovery, when people had lots of jobs and they were making more money than they had in the past, rather than it being around 2008 during the economic crisis, which, if that were the case, then the economy would make a lot more sense. But because it isn't, that it seems to be something else. Another possibility is that maybe teenagers nowadays, and when they were growing up during that time frame, maybe we just had less independence, and that smaller amount of independence led to us feeling like we didn't have the competence to do what we needed to, like we felt lonely, like we didn't have those connections. But there are several issues with this. One in particular is that, again, it doesn't seem to line up, because if that were happening, then you should see it earlier. You shouldn't see it in 2012. Why is it happening in 2012? Another big problem is the question, why? Why did this loss of independence, if it did have an effect, why would it have an effect? And I think that the question answers itself, doesn't it? Because the reason that we would lose independence is the exact reason why Gen X had independence, and that is they didn't have oversight while we do. And where's that oversight? It's our phones. That's where the oversight comes from. Our phones allow us that ease of contact. So technology has provided exactly the thing. And so if that really was the case, if it really was going to simply be an independence problem, well, then you'd have to ask yourself a deeper question, and that is, where does the loss of independence come from? But even so, that doesn't seem to be exactly correct. So let's look at what else might be the case. Another big one that probably a lot of people on the left and those concerned with gun regulations and gun control might think about is school shootings. This has been something that has plagued our generation, something that we have feared, thought about, marched for in many cases, protested for. Yet, is this really a factor? Does this really impact us to such a degree? Well, the question on everyone's minds, if you're really trying to figure this out, is this happening in other countries where school shootings are rare? And in fact, this is also happening in places like Australia, in the UK, places where school shootings are much more rare, where guns are much less readily available. So if that was the case, then that shouldn't happen. You should see the same levels as before, and yet they too are struggling with very similar issues. And that's part of the reason, as a side note, that Gen Z is such an important topic, because so many of the things that affect people in the United States, Generation Z in the United States, also affect Zoomers in other countries. Because technology and many of these other effects have affected us across the lines and borders of nations. They've affected us in different cultures across the world, because these things end up uniting us in both a positive way, allowing us to have more in common, but also a negative way. Another big one that she talks about is the concept that we just live in a difficult time in general, that this is a hellscape, that we're struggling in so many ways, that the modern world is so messed up. Well, for one, if this were the case, again, you'd see this in the past, when things were terrible in many respects, when things where there were protests in the streets, where there were riots, when things were burning, when we were literally in a world war, you would see the same type of thing. But in reality, you actually see the opposite. When we're at our lowest, a lot of times the ability, the feeling and confidence that people have are at their highest, because there's a strange relationship between our psychology and confronting challenges. When you have a clear challenge, sometimes that has the opposite effect of demoralizing you. Sometimes it has the effect of reinvigorating you and making you feel like you can take on the world. And in World War I, World War II, you can actually look back. There was a lot of this feeling of motivation and feeling like you had a cause, a purpose. Along with this, she talks about climate change. And she says that maybe it's climate change. Maybe that's the reason. But if you look at a lot of the survey data again, it actually says that fears about the climate were highest in the 90s, that they were highest in other times. And if that really were the case, that it would be a very different story. Now, for those of us who are plugged in social media, you might say, "Well, this can't be true because in my feed, all I see is doom and gloom about the climate. All I see is that we have 10 years, we have 5 years until something terrible is going to happen. That's all I see." But what you have to realize is that the power of a survey is that it affects people who aren't in your bubble, who aren't seeing the same news feed that you are. So just because you're seeing it, and maybe your group, your friends, the people that you message with on social media, maybe they see it, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone else is seeing the same things. And in fact, that's one of the big changes I think that Gen Z has, is that we are much more isolated in our own unique bubbles. And so while it might seem like the world is one way, in effect, it's actually a million ways. Whereas in the past, it was far more unified. You'd watch a news show, and there were only a handful of them, and they had a very similar narrative, a very similar idea of what it meant to be an American and what we were doing in the world. And now there are so many permutations of what it is. A communist, you can be a social democrat, you can be on the far right, you can be a libertarian, you can be a Nazi. They're just like, it's crazy to see all of the different ideas floating around that you could believe in. And yet, that is one of the things that separates us from boomers, from Gen X, and from this other time. But it's also one of the reasons why I don't think, and she comes to the conclusion that this isn't really what's affecting us because of this difference in narratives, and that in the past, there was actually a much higher fear of climate-related disaster, of climate change. And if that were the case, then you would have seen, at the very least, a big uptick around that time. You would have seen similar effects, higher anxiety, loneliness, depression, all those things would have at least started in the 1990s, but that is not the case. One more alternative is that maybe it's homework. Maybe school nowadays has become so heavy, so much of a weight on our shoulders, that we're struggling just to keep up, that we're struggling to do our job, to be able to move forward because we have so much homework on our hands, and just the pressure of school and of getting into a good college, and all of these has just been a weight. Well, the issue though with this that she talks about is that according to a lot of data, actually it was in the 90s that we spent more time on homework. But more than this even, she talks about how a Gallup survey actually says that we spend about double the amount of time, about 5 hours, on social media versus on doing homework. And that when you track these things, rather than it being a homework problem, it looks like the correlation is much more with social media and the feeling of pressure at school. As the social media pressure, the digital media pressure goes up, so does the feeling of school bearing down on your shoulders, which is a fascinating fact, while simultaneously being something that goes right into the face of this argument. So then what else do we have left? What other things could it be? Two more possibilities are things she talks about, among others. She talks about a couple others, but these two are the biggest ones. One in particular is drugs. That drugs nowadays, that the opioid epidemic has affected young people and really set them back. The problem, of course, with this is that the deaths of despair that are talked about a lot, they actually don't happen among young people. They happen far more among middle-aged adults, particularly men, who, in many cases, who don't have a job and have fallen out of the workforce, and which is completely different than Gen Z, a very different demographic. And while that's an important thing to talk about, seems to not at all bear into effect when it comes to us. The last one I'll like to talk about here is maybe our parents are the problem. Maybe Gen X has just screwed us up, and it's really their fault for all of our struggles, all of our trouble today. But in reality, the rates of depression, the rates of anxiety and things like that among Gen X has remained pretty stable across time. She talks about that. So then what are we left with when we look at this? I think we're left with a very obvious one, and that is around the time of 2012, a new device, a new invention became very popular, and that was the iPhone. That's why in her book, iGen, she calls us iGen instead of Gen Z. Now, that name didn't really catch on well, but it spotlights a big change, and that is the rise of smartphones, digital media, and social media. And with that rise came right along with it, tracking very closely, was also the rise of these internalizing disorders. Things like like I said earlier, loneliness, depression, anxiety, that feeling like you're not able to control your life, that there's too much around you. They call that an external locus of control. And what that means is, rather than thinking you have the ability to affect your world, to make change, to do what you need to do and accomplish the tasks that you need to accomplish, rather you feel like the outside world is the real strong force, that you're not good enough, you're not strong enough to stand in its way, and that really your efforts are not going to amount to much. And that's an external locus of control. All of these things have tracked very well with this rise of social media, of smartphones, and of digital media in general. So that was our first look into the thoughts of Jean Twenge and how she sees Generation Z. We talked about how she began looking into it because of her interest in Gen X, and then during 2012 was trying to figure out why it is we had this rise in internalizing disorders. I went through some of the alternatives and then the reasons why. Next time, we're going to look more deeply into the traits of Gen Z and then overall her thoughts on generations. So thanks for looking into it.